Tynemouth Castle Priory stands on a lonely promontory intruding into the savage North Sea. Legends tell of underground passages and dungeons below the castle and priory site, and among this network lies a cave, often known as Jingling Geordie's Hole, Jingling Man's Hole, or the Wizard's Cave. The entrance apparently lay on the north side of the priory, facing King Edward's Bay. Others say it faces out to sea. Some believe a wizard or an old man lived in the cave, and he made strange clanking noises at night when he prowled the area. But other historians explain that Jingling Geordie was a 17th century pirate and smuggler. The cave provided a handy lookout spot for incoming ships, and apparently he still had fetters on his legs and the rattling chains accompanied his every move. Yet others still think wreckers used the cave. They lit fires at its entrance to lure ships to their destruction on the rocks below. So what exactly is this cave? Is it natural or man-made? And did it belong to a wizard? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick, and welcome to November, which here on the podcast is going to be Subterranean Folklore Month. And as it's also the 5th of November, I should also wish you all a very happy bonfire night, or happy 5th of November, whichever you prefer. I will be basically enacting my time-honoured tradition of watching V for Vendetta this evening, because A, Hugo Weaving, and B, well, I'm sure you can guess the rest. The fact that obviously I know it's not the best adaptation of the comic, don't care, still enjoy it anyway. But anyway, let's get on with this week's episode. I decided that we'd have a look at different types of subterranean space. So rather than me having to find a whole load of legends about like one thing, we could have a look at a few different ranges of underground space. So we'll be having a look at things like catacombs, tunnels, caves, things like that. And this week we're going to look at specific caves of smugglers' caves, because obviously where I live in my part of the world there's actually quite a few of them, and it's largely because of the fact that you've got a large port at Newcastle and obviously the Tyne's right there, and then you've got all these places along the coast where people could stop off and so on. So the first place that we're going to is Tynemouth, which I do sometimes hear people pronounce as Tynemouth, which I find really odd because it's the River Tyne, therefore if it's the mouth of the Tyne, should it not be Tynemouth? But that might also just be my own personal way of doing things. And essentially this is also one of my favourite stories from this area. And as I say, it's all about the castle and priory, which if you know Tynemouth, you'll know that when you come out of the metro and you go all the way along Front Street, which also has this marvellous little alley behind it called Back Front Street, and I always want to put a 2 in there. But anyway, and then you go all the way along to the seafront, and then there's the priory. And last year I actually went round it at night to hear some of its ghost stories, which was pretty atmospheric. But anyway, one of the stories that they did actually tell at the priory was this one, so I did have a bit of I know this story moment, which is always quite nice. But as I said in the introduction, there is supposedly this cave somewhere beneath the priory, and it sometimes is referred to as the Wizard's Cave. So long before Jingling Geordie, who I just think that's the most amazing name, long before his day, a famous and brave knight named Walter the Bold apparently travelled to Tynemouth, because he'd heard tales of a mysterious cave filled with treasure guarded by dragons and demons, and by all accounts it sounds like he was trying to make a bit of a name for himself, so it does rather sound like he thought, aha, this is my opportunity, I shall go and I shall find treasure. Now this particular cave apparently had an arched doorway leading to 2 chambers, and one of them apparently had a hole 12 feet deep leading to 2 small vaults. So Walter clambered down to the cave during the night armed with a sword and a lamp. He pushed his way along a narrow passage, and almost immediately demons and other inhuman spirits attacked him from all sides. Being a brave knight, Walter struck out with his sword, and he pushed his way further into the wizard's cave. But the demons pursued him to the edge of a yawning gap. Seeing its depth, he cursed. Could he make the jump? Now, I do like this part. He actually took off his heavier armour, and I'm presuming that the demons just stood there patiently waiting while he did so. But Walter then said a quick prayer and leapt across the gap. He scrabbled to safety on the far side, leaving the demon stuck behind him. Now Walter followed the passage to a huge door, and a bugle hung on a golden chain beside it. Walter snatched the bugle and blew 3 long, loud blasts. Remember, whenever you find yourself in these kind of situations, doing things 3 times is a pretty good bet that it might work. And if you're not sure why, there is an episode on why 3, 7 and 9 are such important numbers in folklore. Anyway, a magic cock crowed when Walter blew the bugle 3 times and the door burst open. Beyond the door lay a vast chamber, and 12 golden lamps hung on 12 crystal pillars. Piles of gold, silver and precious gems gleamed in the low night. And according to Emma Richardson, it may not be sung what treasures were seen, gold heaped upon gold and emeralds green, and diamonds and rubies and sapphires untold, rewarded the courage of Walter the Bold. Now, the legend doesn't explain how he got back out again, or indeed how he took the treasure with him, but he did apparently manage to do both, becoming a rich lord in the process. And if you believe the legend, he owned 100 castles and ran their vast estates, and he also founded a monastery and married a beautiful princess. Or did he? Because other legends actually say that the caves were haunted, filled with the sounds of moans and chains being dragged. Some believe it was intended to frighten anyone so that they wouldn't follow Walter's example, but perhaps Walter didn't make it out alive. Or perhaps it's just Jingling Geordie scaring people away from his lookout spot. Now, it is quite interesting because, obviously, as I say, I love this story, and I went looking on the British Newspaper Archive thinking, I wonder if anyone else has ever written anything about it. And there was actually this really extensive article written by Harry C. Wayne in the Shields Evening Gazette in 1942, and he actually adds a lot more detail to this, but he also relates a legend that the cave was apparently home to the Witch of Tynemouth, and witch is actually spelled Wytche, because obviously that's going to give it a little bit more veracity if you want to be like ye olde witch. But anyway, she apparently cast her spells in the cave and only ventured out on foggy days. Nothing good is attached to this particular witch, and she's claimed to have caused, among other things, ewes to lose their lambs, pigs to eat their young, and children to have twisted limbs. So, she apparently lived in the cave as well. There's not really any legend about what happened to her other than the fact that she was just simply there. But we'll come back to that in a minute. In another legend, Ceolwulf, king of Northumbria, apparently lived in the cave in the 8th century after abdicating his throne and becoming a hermit. But Harry C. Wayne also points out that the cave is not a natural formation, something that was discovered in the 1840s, because masonry formed part of the entrance, and apparently there was indeed the 12-foot hole inside the cave that led to a square room below. And I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I came across a cave that was perfectly square. So it does rather sound like there has been some human intervention at some point. A narrow corridor actually led to another room, but no one seems to have gone any further than that, so I don't know if there is suddenly this yawning chasm that you've got to take your armour off to leap over, or if indeed there's a massive door with a bugle hanging next to it, because they never seem to go that far. But someone did suggest it may have been part of a network of underground passages belonging to the priory above, but no one knows for sure. It's entirely possible that there would be passages, because obviously the monks may want somewhere to hide their own valuables in the days of Viking raids. It's possible that they may have wanted passages in order to effect their escape, or who knows, maybe they were involved in smuggling rings as well before everybody else. But no one's really sure. Now, I mean, the castle and priory site has been in use for a really long time, and even after the dissolution of the monasteries, it was still in use. So there's been people on the site for a long, long time. But a landslip apparently destroyed the cave's entrance in the 1880s, and I must admit, while researching this post, I did find conflicting articles where some said that you could still get into the entrance of the wizard's cave, others said that a cave-in made it impossible to get much further than a couple of feet, and other commenters said that you could get further, but then you'd be cut off at high tide. So, who knows if dragons or demons did actually bring down the ceiling to seal off their treasure? The wizard's cave is unlikely to uncover more of its secrets. Now, I do highly recommend a visit to the priory anyway, if only to see the beautiful oratory chapel. It is absolutely stuffed with tales of ghosts and what have you in the priory and castle itself, so it is worth a visit. But if you do go down to the beach late at night and you hear a clank of chains, you would do well to pick up your pace. Now, it is quite difficult to know if the wizard's cave was a cave, passage, tunnel or something else, but there are, as I said in the introduction, a lot more caves along the northeast coast which are quite clearly caves, and they were obviously more clearly associated with smuggling. And in so doing, they've also picked up their own folklore as well. So if you just head a tiny little way up the coast from Tynemouth, you'll then find the small hamlet of Cullercoats. And while I was researching this, apparently that originally came from an Old English word of culver coats, meaning like dovecoats, and it's just become changed over time. Now, Cullercoats is better known for its fishing history, although smuggling does run alongside this. And customs collectors in major ports would charge customs on incoming goods, so smuggling became a way to bring goods into the country without paying the customs charge. Now, riding officers would patrol coves and inlets to watch for anyone unloading goods in the area, while customs ships would then just basically go up and down the coast and they would challenge any ships that looked like they were going to offload any goods before they reached port. Now, in some cases, people from local communities might work the riding officer roles because they knew the area well and could then be paid for their local knowledge. Others would then join the smuggling rings for a cut of the profits in selling sought-after goods like brandy and tea. And obviously, if you are interested in tea, then there is the extra tea episode as well. Now, I must admit, there are a couple of legends, and I don't know how true they are, of some people who were both riding officer and smuggler. So I dare say some people were making money out of both. But back to Cullercoats. If you do go down into Cullercoats Bay, and obviously anyone listening to this who's familiar with the northeast, you'll know how you've got those two massive piers and really quite a small gap to get out to the sea. Well, if you look in the cliff face along the back of the bay, you do have a few caves in that area, and they are still referred to as Smugglers' Caves, but the caves were also apparently known locally as the Fairies' Caves. And I do have to wonder if smugglers actually suggested the name to deter locals from wandering too close. And that is also my theory about the Witch of Tynemouth legend, that again that may have been invented to keep people away from the cave, particularly at night. Now, what was really interesting was I actually found the Fairies' Cave mention on the Fairy Folklorist blog, and this was a blog post from 2010, and she noted that she only found out because it was mentioned on one of the information boards in the area, but very few of the local history books actually mention this, so it does make me wonder if it's incredibly localised knowledge that's now being lost outside of Cullercoats or not, because it is also quite difficult to know which is the Fairies' Cave. And again, I was looking on British newspaper archives to see if anything could shed any light on this, and a Joseph Lumsden found the body of a man named Elgar William Harrison in the Smuggler's Cave that was known as the Fairies' Hall in 1928. So I thought it was quite interesting. It's not just a Fairies' Cave, it's an actual hall. So it makes me think of the three caves it could apply to. This is probably the largest one, and also the one that really freaked me out when I went the last time, because I was down on Cullercoats Bay and I was like, I'm going to take photos and I'll share images with people about what they look like. And I went to go in the largest one. And it was really funny because there was like bits of the rock face started coming off either side of us, and then this like pigeon flew out at me, and I was like, okay, I'm going to take that as a sign. I'm not going into the cave. Although, and I always tell this story, back when I was in class 1, so I'd have been about 5 or something, my school went to Cullercoats. I cannot remember why. I just remember us being told, do not go in the caves. And people always jump in with sort of stuff in response to this particular story on Twitter. I should point out the tide was well out. There were plenty of supervising adults. There was nothing in the caves other than seaweed. But yeah, there was this, the teachers were like, don't go in the caves. Of course, because we were all 5, we decided we'd all go in the caves. And I remember they were a lot bigger when I was 5 than they were when I went back as an adult. But there is a weird atmosphere in them, but that could also just be the fact that they quite clearly get used by impromptu toilets. But as I say, there are 3 different caves that it could apply to, and I think it's probably the largest of the 3. But because it's like knowledge that's now being lost, we'll possibly never really know for definite. But it is quite interesting that these caves have quite clearly been linked with smuggling at some stage. And if you also head further south, you'll find Marsden Beach, which is home of the Marsden Grotto pub. And Marsden is essentially past South Shields, so it's between South Shields and Souter. So if you remember the Lighthouse Legends episode that I did a little while ago, Marsden's just along from Souter. Now, the Marsden Grotto is actually called a cave bar pub, and it's so named because the pub is in, you guessed it, a cave. Now, back in the 18th century, lead miner Jack Bates lived in the cave on the beach, and in 1782 he basically blasted the smaller cave into a much larger one. Initially he ran a tea room from the space, but then eventually he moved into the smuggling business. Now, Bates actually died in 1792, but a man named Peter Allen apparently bought the grotto in 1826 and he expanded it, and then since then it's now essentially a restaurant with hotel space as well. And there's actually a lift that then takes you up to the top of the coastal path because it's pretty far down into Marsden Bay itself. But the building is actually widely thought to be haunted, with people reporting knocking from inside the cellar, rattling chains in the bar and whispering in empty rooms. Now, there are still other caves in the bay as well, although again they're probably more often used as impromptu toilets than smugglers' dens. And when I was last down there, I did go and have a look at some of them, and some of them are like really low, like they're about maybe 2 feet tall, and they don't go back very far. So obviously the sea just hasn't worn them out enough, whereas there are other ones which are sort of taller than me and go back a little bit further, which would also have made a great place to stash things. But what do we ultimately make of these northeast coast caves? Well, given the proximity of Tynemouth, Marsden Bay and Cullercoats Bay to the Tyne, you can see why they'd be really popular with smugglers. And it's also interesting that Tynemouth and Cullercoats appear to have such legends of witches, wizards, ghosts and fairies associated with the caves, because what better way to deter people from poking around your smuggling locations? Now, don't forget, way back when, in the episode about phantom coaches, there was a belief that a particular story of a phantom coach in Torland was actually a front, essentially, to scare people away who might actually stumble across local smugglers. So I do think that there is a bit of a precedent for people using such tales of the supernatural to try and stop people from coming across what they're doing, which they shouldn't be. Now, the caves in Cullercoats Bay are the most easily accessible. Just simply head down to the beach and walk right up to them. Obviously, make sure you know the tide times beforehand, but you can literally just walk straight to them and they are there. And a lot of people like taking photos from inside them out over. There is another cave which I only just discovered the other day, which is actually, once you go past the southern pier and sort of follow the rocks round on Long Sands, which is the beach in Tynemouth, there's a massive cave there, and it's entirely possible that that was also a smuggler's cave as well, because that's even more difficult to get to, so it would obviously be quite helpful. But also, if you pop to the Marsden Grotto, you can at least enjoy a spot of lunch while you're there. But Tynemouth ultimately is the cave that continues to fascinate me, because we still don't know where or even what it is, and quite frankly, I'll never stop being intrigued by the name Jinglin' Geordie's Hole. Maybe it was part of the Priory's underground passages, maybe it was used by wreckers. Either way, it looks like the dragons probably won't need to scare anyone off anytime soon. So please do let me know what you think of these smugglers' caves. I do think it is interesting how they have used folklore to deter people from their somewhat illegal activities. That bit did appeal to me. We are going to have a look in a completely different way at catacombs and things like that next week, because I was wondering how on earth I could get the Paris catacombs into an episode, because it is a really, really interesting place to visit. So we're going to look at catacombs in all their glory, because obviously they are usually underground. So that's what we'll be having a look as part of subterranean folklore. So I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. As ever, tell a friend, leave a review, all that kind of jazz. But I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.